In 1930, in a cereal factory in Battle Creek, Michigan, a company did something that should have changed the shape of the 20th century. It cut its workers' hours by a quarter, and productivity went up. Wages didn't collapse. Workers, when asked years later, overwhelmingly said they wanted to keep it that way. 3 years later, in the same country, the United States Senate did something even bigger. It voted, and passed, a bill that would have made 30 hours the standard American work week. By law. Nationwide. Neither of those experiments survives today. You work roughly the same 40-hour week your grandparents did, and you've probably never once questioned that number, because it feels less like a policy and more like a law of nature, just how work works. It isn't. It's the surviving side of a fight that almost nobody alive today was ever told happened. A fight over how much of your one life belongs to you, and how much belongs to your job. This is the story of the 30-hour workweek America actually had, for a while. And exactly who made sure you'd never get to keep it. You've probably heard some version of this before. For most of human history, work didn't look anything like it does now. In the 1960s, anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, most famously the San people of the Kalahari, found that meeting basic needs took as little as 15 to 20 hours a week. The rest of their time went into rest, storytelling, extended childcare, and each other. The anthropologist Marshall Solins gave this a name that still needles economists today, the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more. Affluent because they wanted less, and the gap between their needs and their environment's abundance left them enormous amounts of free time. More, by some measures, than the average person working full-time gets today, once you count the commute, the emails after dinner, and the work that quietly follows you home. That part of the story gets told constantly now. And it's a fair point, a genuinely useful reminder that grinding through an 8-hour day, 5 days a week, isn't hardwired into being human. But it leaves the actual question unanswered. If constant labor isn't natural, how did we get here? How did entire societies get engineered into working 16-hour days for well over a century? That didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen because human nature changed. It happened through deliberate campaigns, economic, legal, even architectural, each with a name, a date, and people who defended it. The first campaign didn't target how much you worked at all. It targeted something stranger, how you experienced time itself. Before industrialization, most people didn't work by the hour. They worked by the task. A farmer's day ended when the field was plowed, not when a bell rang. A weaver worked in bursts tied to daylight and the rhythm of the craft, hard for a stretch, then not at all, then hard again. Time was measured by what needed doing, not a number on a dial. The historian E.P. Thompson gave this way of living a name, task orientation. And he pointed out something almost no "why do we work so much" explainer ever mentions. The switch from task time to clock time wasn't a side effect of factories showing up. It was the precondition for them. You cannot run an assembly line if people show up whenever they personally feel the work is done. Factories needed a population that treated time itself as a thing owed to an employer, hour by hour. So that population got built. Factory owners installed their own bells and whistles to replace the church bell that once marked a town's rhythm, now ringing for production, not the Sabbath. Workers were fined for showing up late. Time clocks didn't just record hours worked, they made lateness visible, countable, and punishable in a way task-based work never had been. Even the length of a lunch break, something that used to just happen whenever people were hungry, became a number someone else decided and enforced. It wasn't only economic pressure. It was moral pressure. Sunday schools and reform pamphlets spent enormous energy preaching punctuality and diligence as virtues, as if it wasn't just convenient for your employer. Idleness, a concept that barely existed as a moral failing before, got reinvented as something close to a sin. Being industrious stopped describing what you did and became a description of who you were. Within about 2 generations, an entire population had its relationship with time retrained from the ground up. Not because anyone decided the clock was a better way to live, but because for a rapidly growing number of people, refusing to live by it meant starving. Which brings us to the second engine behind the normal work week. It wasn't chosen. It was legislated into existence. For centuries before industrialization, most English peasants weren't wealthy, but they weren't fully dependent on a wage either. Common land, shared pasture, forest, and field that no single person owned, let ordinary families graze animals, gather fuel, and grow food entirely outside the cash economy. It was a thin safety net. But it was theirs, And as long as it existed, nobody could force a family into a factory simply by threatening them with nothing to eat. Then came enclosure. Through a long wave of Acts of Parliament in the 1700s and 1800s, common land across England was fenced off and handed to private landowners. Officially framed as an efficiency measure. In practice, it stripped huge numbers of rural families of the one thing that had let them say no to wage labor. And in case losing the land wasn't enough on its own, the law closed the loop from the other direction. Vagrancy laws made it a punishable offense to simply be unemployed. In their harshest forms, repeated idleness could mean branding or forced servitude. Later versions filled workhouses instead, institutions designed to make any wage job outside look like the better option. Take away the land that let people live without selling their labor. Then criminalize the state of not having sold it. What you get is a population with no remaining legal path around it. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into the video, because it's a lot less comforting than human nature simply changed. Human nature didn't change. The options did. And once wage labor became the only legal way to survive, the people running the factories had almost no incentive to make that labor humane, let alone short. Until, for one strange and largely forgotten stretch of the 20th century, a handful of people did exactly the opposite. On December 1, 1930, barely a year into the Great Depression, the Kellogg Company in Battle Creek, Michigan did something almost no other major employer in America was doing. Instead of laying more people off as demand cratered, it restructured the plant from 3 8-hour shifts a day into 4 6-hour shifts. Same total output, spread across more people. The reasoning wasn't pure charity. Company President Lewis Brown had been shaped by a British industrialist who argued shorter hours were sound business strategy, not just a humane gesture. Rested workers, the theory went, would be more productive per hour than exhausted ones, and the new fourth shift would soak up unemployed workers from a town that badly needed jobs. W.K. Kellogg himself backed the change publicly, framing it as a chance to shift the balance of people's lives away from pure survival and towards something closer to freedom. At first, Kellogg's paid workers for 7 hours even though they were only working 6, treating the extra hour as an investment. 2 years later, once output per hour had actually risen under the shorter shifts, the company matched what workers had previously earned for a full 8-hour day. And by nearly every available measure, it worked. Herbert Hoover's own Unemployment Relief Committee praised the move. Business Week and Harvard's Business School studied it as a case worth learning from. The New York Times called it a complete success. And most importantly, Kellogg's own workers loved it. In plant-wide votes, roughly 2/3 chose to keep the 6-hour day over 8. People used the extra hours exactly the way you'd hope. Gardening. Fishing. Building things with their kids. Actually being present in their own neighborhoods. Some workers later pointed to the years right after the 6-hour day ended as the moment their community changed for the worse, less time to volunteer, less time to look out for each other. So if it worked, and workers wanted it, and the company itself credited it as good business, why isn't the 6-hour day the American standard today? The plant held on to 6-hour shifts for over 50 years. But cracks started after World War II, when new management arrived, people who hadn't built the policy and weren't invested in defending it. Slowly, a 6-hour shift got framed as somehow less serious than a real 8-hour job. Department by department, workers were offered higher pay in exchange for switching to 8 hours. Here's the detail that should stop you: the 6-hour day wasn't killed because it failed. It survived until 1985, and its end had almost nothing to do with productivity. Over time, workers themselves increasingly chose more hours, so they could afford to consume more. When the last 6-hour shift ended, some workers held a mock funeral for it at a local bar. The experiment didn't collapse under its own weight. It was slowly talked out of existence, one incentive at a time, by people who decided more hours and more consumption was the respectable way to live. Kellogg's was one company, in one small town. But at the exact moment its 6-hour experiment was proving itself, something much bigger was happening 2,000 miles away. While Kellogg's 6-hour experiment was already 3 years old, a strikingly similar idea was moving through the United States Senate, this time as an entire nation's law, not one company's choice. In December 1932, Senator Hugo Black of Alabama introduced a bill drafted with the American Federation of Labor, a national maximum of 30 hours a week for any business shipping goods across state lines. The logic was blunt. The country had catastrophic unemployment and a roughly fixed amount of work available. So instead of some people working full shifts while millions had nothing, spread the work around. Supporters estimated the bill could create something like 6 million jobs almost overnight. This was not a fringe idea. The head of the American Federation of Labor was publicly demanding 6-hour days at labor rallies that same spring. The newly inaugurated President Franklin Roosevelt and his incoming Labor Secretary, Francis Perkins, both initially backed the concept. And on April 6, 1933, barely a month into Roosevelt's presidency, the Senate actually passed it, by a vote of 53-30. Not a symbolic gesture. A real, recorded, bipartisan vote for a 30-hour national work week, sitting exactly one chamber away from becoming the law of the land. For about 9 days, American newspapers covered it like the seismic shift it was. A brand new magazine called Newsweek put it right on the cover. Then the opposition organized. The National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce lobbied hard once the bill reached the House, arguing it would choke off recovery rather than help it. Roosevelt, who had never fully committed to the idea, began looking for an alternative that could satisfy labor without locking business into a hard 30-hour ceiling it could never renegotiate. Francis Perkins drafted a substitute adding minimum wage protections alongside the hours limit, a version business groups fought just as hard. By May 1, less than a month after the Senate vote, the administration quietly withdrew its support entirely. In its place came the National Industrial Recovery Act, a far bigger, vaguer bill that let individual industries set their own hour and wage codes, subject only to government approval. The House Rules Committee never even brought the original 30-hour bill to a floor vote. It wasn't defeated. It simply never got the chance to be voted on again. Black reintroduced versions of the bill in 1935 and 1937. Neither passed. When the Fair Labor Standards Act became law in 1938, the standard work week it settled on wasn't 30 hours. It was 40. The 40-hour week you work today wasn't calculated as optimal for output or well-being. It's simply what was left standing after the alternative got quietly out-lobbied in about 3 weeks. So why did two separate, independently successful experiments in shorter hours end the same way? Business leaders at the time weren't especially shy about the actual reason. It wasn't that a 30-hour week failed. The fear was that it would work too well. Once workers experienced a shorter week at the same pay, they'd never willingly go back. That was never a productivity argument. It was a fight over who decides how much of your life belongs to your job. That fight reflected a much larger shift in the American economy, from producing enough to meet people's needs, toward consuming enough to keep growing indefinitely. A shorter work week makes sense in a world built around meeting needs and stopping. It makes far less sense to an economy that increasingly needs people working, earning, and spending more, not less. In 1930, the same year Kellogg's cut its shifts to 6 hours, economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that by 2030, a 15-hour work week would be more than enough to meet most people's needs. He wasn't describing some radical fringe idea. He treated it as an obvious, almost inevitable consequence of technological progress. We're now inside the final years of Keynes' own deadline. The technology arrived, roughly on schedule. The 15-hour week didn't, because the people holding the power to keep it chose not to. This isn't purely history. Shorter week pilots have quietly resurfaced, trial programs in Iceland and the UK testing 4-day weeks at full pay, with results echoing what Battle Creek reported a century earlier. The 40-hour week isn't a natural law, and it isn't really an economic one either. It's the surviving policy from a fight that almost nobody alive today was ever told happened. Workers in Battle Creek proved a shorter day could work, and that they wanted it, for over 50 years. A Senate majority voted to make it the law of the entire country. Both got walked back, not because they failed, but because enough powerful people worried they might succeed permanently. This doesn't mean the 8-hour day is some grand conspiracy still being enforced today. It means the number your life is built around was never inevitable. It was chosen, contested, and rechosen. It was chosen by people making decisions in rooms you weren't in. Which leaves exactly one question worth sitting with: if it was a choice once, whose choice is it now? If this is the kind of history that usually gets left out of the textbook version, that's basically all I do here. Subscribe if you want the next one when it's out.